Okay, notice, without looking down, where your hands are right now. And feel where your feet are. You know where they are without looking, not through your sense of touch, but through your sense of proprioception. This is what allows us to be aware of where the body is, motion, and its spatial extent. So I can feel that my arms end here. I know they don't extend down to the ground or out to the walls. Proprioception. Lesson number 1. So this is the sense that is played with when German artist Rebecca Horn puts a participant into her piece Arm Extensions. Excuse me. The woman stands with her back to the camera, her hands and lower arms wrapped in cylinders of fabric, which extend to the floor beside her feet and also thicken the diameter of her arms. A crisscross of strips encircles her from mid-torso to ankles, binding her legs together. Starting with this piece in 1968 and continuing until 1975, Horn produced a number of sculptures to be worn by a participant or by the artist herself. The artist didn't title it as a series, but the word extension is in many of the individual titles, so I refer to this work collectively as extensions. On the right are 2 pieces from Berlin Exercises, a 1974-75 suite of short films documenting Horn's performances, many of which use body-extending sculptures. These are the 3 works I'm talking about today. American art historian Amelia Jones describes a general shift happening at this time, from a modernism in which the artist was generally invisible and absent from the finished work, toward a new trend of art practices centered on the artist's body. Body art and performance art are emerging before these works by Horn and also during this time, each proposing their own complications for the body's relationship to subjectivity. The Australian artist Stellark's piece, Third Hand, comes along in 1980, extending his body prosthetically and using electronics to allow him to trigger its motion and receive tactile feedback. Arm Extensions, 12 years earlier, creates an analog cyborg. It limits function. The performer can't use her hands or move her legs individually. At the same time as it extends, she can use her arms as legs, her 2 feet as one. Horn describes extensions as originating from her personal episode of extended hospitalization and the ways it dramatically altered her corporeal experience. Extensions began with the aim of communicating these experiences to her performers. But more than this, Arm Extensions exemplifies the gestures that persist through the extension series, which are as follows. To the performer, Horn offers this experience of distorted proprioception, giving her the sense of a body altered in form and both enhanced and limited in function, and an ambiguity between the body and the sculpture as she begins to see it as part of herself. The observer, encountering documentation of the piece, Horn invites into empathy with the performer so that he or she might wonder, what would that feel like? And feel not just in terms of touch, or even emotion, but in terms of physical extent and capabilities. Beyond these sensory engagements, this work brings to light a fundamental ambiguity. The extension Horn adds to the body enters an in-between space where it is partially identifiable with the subject, the participant, who is capable of feeling through it, moving it, and acting upon other objects with it. The sculpture's ambiguous status exposes a loose correlation between the form of the body, the somatic senses that generate a first-hand experience of it, proprioception among them, and the intellectual construct of the body. This implicates the flesh itself as also having this unstable status, wobbling between subject and object. These gestures have implications for thinking about where the body actually ends and therefore where the subject can be located. Most scholars in the humanities would no longer claim that an individual can be fruitfully discussed in isolation from his or her social context. Yet the body, though emergent from and as the matter of its environment, is still seen erroneously as something isolatable. Descartes placed the body in the object category along with all other matter, speaking of consciousness as me, the subject, and the body as an object over there with everything else. This thinking has been challenged, yet efforts by cultural critics to counter Cartesian disembodiment have sometimes led to another problem: the strict location of the subject in and as the body. Horn's work advances questions that complicate both these formulations. The subject does not float in a transcendental space distinct from the body, but considering our radical contingency on material conditions outside the skin, think atmosphere, for example, the subject cannot be said to begin and end at this boundary. Arm extensions begins to enact the perceptual shifts that evoke these questions. The artist comments about arm extensions that after being in the piece for a while, the subject gains the impression that, in spite of her erect posture, her arms are gradually touching the ground as if they were actually growing into the floor. Statements like this reflect Horn's interest in distorting the performer's corporeal experience. This alteration of proprioception causes the slippage I'm talking about between subject, performer, and object, sculpture, this I-it ambiguity. Horn speaks of the performer of this piece potentially feeling that her arms stretch to twice their length and come to rest on the floor, but only if the performer identifies with the sculpture as herself can she say that her arms touch the ground. The last phrase of Horn's quote complicates the separation between human and environment. She talks about a sense that one's arms are growing into the floor. If the performer develops the sense Horn describes, the perceptual divides not only between body and sculpture, but between these and the rest of the world soften and become less strident. The boundary between body and all other matter reveals itself as perceptually arbitrary. Feathers Dancing on Shoulders, a piece from Berlin Exercises, also builds upon the body of the performer to achieve a sense of proprioceptive extension. A system of strings connects the feather shafts to the wearer's feet, such that motions with a foot or leg translate into dips and folds on the row of feathers on the shoulder above. The participant moves with an aura of experimentation, as if she's learning to use her new parts by observing causality between her lower body motions and their effect on the extensions. With many extension pieces, Horn worked with participants over time to produce a change in their bodily awareness. She asked people to work with her devices repeatedly until they adjusted to them as part of their bodies. Horn says that through the act of fitting it and wearing it time after time, a process of identification begins to evolve, an essential factor for the performance. Feathers Dancing shows this method unfolding. Horn's immersive approach is reflected in this film, which records the inquisitive attitude of the performance, its improvisational quality, and in particular the way that dancers' gaze is often trained on her new parts and how they respond to her motions. This piece highlights the potential to temporarily experience one's own body as actively operating beyond the boundary of the skin, a disruption that reveals the fluidity of the proprioceptive sense. It can adjust to incorporate objects worn on the body, as with prosthesis, but extending rather than replacing. And here, being able to move these parts, the performer learns to dance with them as if they were her own. Okay, now remember the feeling of noticing where your hands are without looking at them. And of course you know that they end here and they don't go beyond that. But now imagine if they did, if you didn't look and you couldn't tell that they weren't actually reaching out until your fingers bumped the opposite sides of the room. This is what Rebecca Horn does in touching the walls with both hands simultaneously, also from Berlin Exercises, a piece the artist performs herself. Proprioception is altered here too, a sense of spatial extent. Horn constructed gloves using balsa wood dowels supporting the fabric to lengthen her fingers so that she can experience reaching across the width of the room. She walks slowly to the back of the room, then returns, scraping the fingers continually along the walls as she goes. The artist says, "My own body space expanded to take in the entire room." The quote affirms her sense of the body operating outside the skin. She describes elsewhere the feeling of scraping her extended fingers on the distant walls. Hence, her sense-receptive body has indeed expanded to the size of the room. But again, these sensory effects are not the work's only impact. Extensions are an inquiry into the body environment cut. They complicate the separation between human and other matter, and suggest that the division cannot be so clearly drawn as it is in common parlance. Even some philosophical and art critical texts collapse the self into the body and assume the subject can be located there. Horn's interventions and their foregrounding of the contiguous nature of the body and environment reopen and perpetuate questions texts like these close. Thank you.